Like all of today's speakers, I have been asked to address the theme of margins in feminist art history. So I've decided to begin that endeavor of speaking about the margins in feminist art history by looking at this image with you. And I'll talk about the image itself for a while, and then following its lead, I want to move on to a more methodological discussion of margins and centers as they affect feminist art history. We're looking at a daguerreotype from the mid-19th century. And from the style of this little strip of metal right here, we can pin down its likely date of production. The photograph was probably taken in 1852, 1853. That little strip of metal is called a preserver, by the way. I'm going to mention it later on, so I'll tell you the name. And it's small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, so my image is not very representative of the actual object. This object is marginal in more than one way. It's marginal because it's an example of vernacular photography, a genre which resides somewhere on the edges of art history. It's not fully out, but it's not fully in either. This particular daguerreotype enjoys no place in a public museum or an archival collection that would lend it institutional significance. From the historian's perspective as well, the image is of marginal interest because its sitter is not securely identified. Most likely, this is a woman named Mary Ann Scrimes Graham. She was a resident of Kingston, Ontario, and while she was no doubt central to the lives of her husband and her 4 children, she garnered no public recognition in her lifetime. A woman, then, on the margins of history. Mais ce n'est pas vraiment la marginalité de l'objet qui m'intéresse, mais plutôt les marges de l'objet lui-même. Et spécifiquement, le petit bout de papier qu'on trouve à son bord inférieur. Someone, probably, but not certainly the artist herself, has prized open the metal preserver, which clamps together the different parts of the daguerreotype, in order to insert this handwritten phrase under the glass. I'm not myself at all. Now, the most obvious interpretation of this little slip of paper is that it registers customer dissatisfaction with the likeness and the photographer. Probably the stiffness and the formality occasioned by the long exposure time of the photograph didn't sit well with the sitter's own self-image. I like to imagine that she was kind of vivacious and that this got entirely lost in that photograph. But rather than simply hiding away her unsatisfactory photograph in a drawer, which is what I do with my photos that I don't like, rather than doing that, she chose instead to intervene in it by means of 5 short words. And these words undermine all the most powerful assertions of 19th century portrait photography. Because you know, the magic of the 19th century photograph was supposed to lie in its powers of representational fidelity. It really captured the truth of the person, not for her. Alors ici, il me semble qu'on voit en pleine vigueur la potentielle déstabilisante des marges dont Fanny a parlé. The marginal interpolation that she has inserted possesses a power to critique that comes from its position outside and yet simultaneously inside a dominant system. Il y a donc une ambivalence dans le positionnement de la marginalité, d'où vient sa force. Mais ce que je trouve fascinant est que cette dynamique d'ambivalence se reproduit dans le daguerréotype lui-même. Je vais expliquer. Est-ce qu'il y a parmi vous quelques-uns qui ont déjà eu l'expérience de tenir en main un daguerréotype? Alors, je suis d'accord avec la plupart de ce que vous avez dit, surtout la question de la matérialité de l'objet. There is this wonderful materiality of the daguerreotype image that creates a tremendous sense of. Il y a une matérialité de cette image qui that creates a tremendous sense of presence. Often there's velvet when you open it up. There's a sense also that of tangibility to the object. So on the one hand, we have this big sense of presence, but on the other hand, you talked about the fact that the photographic image is printed on metal. And this is where I'd like to highlight something different. You talked about the static nature of the image. And of course, here it is very static. But what also happens when you open up a daguerreotype, because the image is printed directly on the metal plate, is that every time you move your hand or you move your head, the image flickers in and out of view. It's actually very hard to get that photograph because most of the time you can't actually see the person. You have to be holding it in directly the right way in order to pull the person up. So while we have a strong sense of presence through the materiality, we also have this ghostly quality, an element of absence. The visual effect that the daguerreotype portrait produces is of a sitter who is as often not there as she is there. One of the things that intrigues me about this little slip of paper up at the top is that its words reproduce this same effect of absent presence. I want you to think about the words and focus on what they're saying. On the one hand, the author clearly disavows herself. I'm not myself at all, she tells us. And yet, by the simple fact of using the I, she claims and occupies the very thing that she's trying to turn her back on. I am not myself at all. A semiotician might discuss this in terms of the clash between the denotative meaning of the words, that means the literal message that they're conveying to you, and the performative effect of the words, what the phrase actually does in its very utterance. Alors, malgré que les mots refusent le soi, le fait que c'est un « je » qui les annonce reproduit la caractère vacillante de l'image. Le sujet est là, et pourtant, il semble qu'elle n'y est pas. C'est fantasmatique. So for more than a decade now, I've been exploring this aspect of subjective ambivalence as a dynamic that is fundamental to a broad range of visual and material culture produced by women in Canada in the 19th and 20th centuries. And you'll see right away where I've taken the title from my book from. So coincidentally, the invitation to address this colloquium came at the precise moment when I was finalizing the introduction to that book. And this coincidence enabled me to see that my concern with subjectivity is actually a response to the positions of marginality and centeredness that women occupied in 19th century Canada. What effects, both positive and negative, stem from the subjective experience of being on the margins? And if we reposition ourselves at the center of our own stories, what effects of marginalization do we produce in turn? Feminist art historians have had a complex relation to art historical accounts that are centered on the subject. Traditional art history, with its monographic valorization of individual artists, has long put the creative subject squarely at the center of its narrative, mythologizing creative expression while reinforcing constructions of personal genius that have remained largely unavailable to women. So traditional art history, it's all about centering the subject, and feminists have been skeptical about that. There has been a hackneyed reduction of women artists to their private lives, often to their romantic misadventures, that has led to a suspicion of biography that permeates much feminist art history, even as many of us work to restore the possibility of agency to those from whom it has too often been withdrawn. On voit un dilemme donc pour l'historienne de l'art féministe. On veut l'artiste avec ses potentiels, ses capacités, mais on est sceptique envers les traditions biographiques. In resolving this dilemma, feminists have frequently turned to a discussion of the social and the structural factors that condition our places in the world. We've turned away quite a bit, I'd say, from the individual to focus on the structural issues or the structural factors that condition that individual. And dynamics of race, of class, of gender have loomed especially large here. These are identity-driven discourses, and they have been typically led by those who have been positioned at the margins of dominant social formations. Notre désir est fort de revaloriser l'identité de ceux qui ont été relégués dans les marges de la société. This is feminism's celebratory urge, visible also amongst indigenous peoples and other racialized communities. And yet, the mantle of identity sits heavy on the shoulders of marginalized constituencies. For formations of identity are also attended by a whole retinue of expectations, assumptions, restrictions of being. There is at times a reifying and reductive thrust to identity-based thought, which can slip from liberatory intent to repressive constraint in the blink of an eye. In such cases, identity thinking pins us down, even as it seeks to empower us. I have often felt this tension. On the one hand, I willingly recognize my debt to the rich legacy of scholarship that prioritizes identity as a response to the historical experience of marginalization, and the need to capture the particular experiences of specific constituencies. But yet, I am also uneasy with the frame of reference that identity thinking predicates. Alors, ma réponse à cette difficulté a été de déplacer légèrement mon cadre de référence, de prendre mes distances, au moins un peu, de l'analyse de l'identité sociale et de me pencher plutôt dans la problématique de la subjectivité, comprise ici comme le sens intériorisé de soi. Having said that, I don't want to overemphasize or make too much of that distinction. Obviously, our understandings of soi, of self, are manifestly shaped by the social identities into which we are either born or interpolated. Subjectivity or identity, ultimately, it's less a matter of choosing between alternatives than of shifting our perspective on the same phenomena, of whether we approach the subject from the inside, subjectivity, or from without, your identity. There are advantages to each viewpoint. But the advantages that attach to subjectivity are, I would argue, particularly welcome just now. For I think consideration of the self is more likely to reveal the contradictions, the uncertainties, the fractures that are so characteristic of our interior experience. alors que la pensée identitaire peut tendre vers le monolithique. Les discussions de soi, ou sur le soi, s'orientent vers la nuance, laissant la place à la complexité qui pourrait autrement être trop facilement évincée. Take a look at my daguerreotype one last time. Did you notice the quotation marks that surround the phrase? They're interesting too, for they indicate to us that the I who first spoke these words is not the same as the I who wielded the pen, or the I who sat to the photographer. Historical art by women in Canada is filled with those kind of complexities. And while they unfold in ways that often accord with narratives of race, or class, or gender, it's only by attending to their highly specific and individualized articulations that we can do justice, I think, to the multiplicity of forces and positions that shape artists and the objects that they make. What I'm suggesting then is not that we should leave identity behind, but rather that we might do well to come at it anew. At a moment when the art world is once again mobilizing around marginalized groups, the fundamental premises of our discourse require continued examination if we are to navigate between two extremes, between that of a reductive and narrowly conceived identity politics on the one hand, and on the other, between the equally harmful assertion that we are somehow post-identity. My thinking is, in this respect, in line with that of Amelia Jones, who is influentially called on art historians to deconstruct the dominant ideological role that identity plays, while drawing out the complexities of all identifications. Et je pense qu'un retour à la question de subjectivité peut nous aider à faire ça. The feminist theorist Denise Riley once, long time ago, summed up the basic tension of female experience as this: that while it is impossible to fully be a woman, it's also impossible never to be one. More recently, queer theory has reinforced and broadened the relevance of this message across and between genders. As the narratives of identity that our societies offer to us repeatedly fail to conform to our experiences, we respond in different ways. Sometimes, collectively, we succeed in changing the narratives. More often than not, we are also riddled by the tensions that they produce, especially when we reside, as everyone in this room does, at the intersection of competing identities. We both are and are not ourselves. Straddling between inside and outside, it is the privilege of marginality to help us see this ambivalence in ourselves and in others. To pay attention to that multiplicity of the margins is, I think, to court a more generous understanding of historical agency, both in the artists whose works we look at and in ourselves. Thank you.